Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 2D Twin Stick Top Down Shooter. My name is Casanis. Guys, in the last episode, we took a look at our camera and moving our camera around with our character. In this episode, we're going to take a look at adding art and some really simple animation to our character, and we're going to do it with an idea called scriptable objects. All right, let's get started. Okay, guys, so to add art to our game, I'm just going to quickly discuss how I created the art and what I had to do to get it ready for Unity. So, first of all, I'm working with Photoshop. You don't have to. However, Unity does have a number of plugins that makes working with Photoshop really easy. So I'm working with Photoshop, but it's not something that's necessary that you do. I've created this really kind of basic character, and it doesn't look basic right here. That's because everything is piled on top of each other. Everything is kind of jammed in place. You don't have to do it this way either. This is the easiest way if you're going to rig a character. This is the easiest way to have everything where you want it, everything kind of aligned up where you want it, and then go ahead and rig it. In this series, we're not going to rig these characters. I've added really basic, simplistic animation, and I'm going to stick with really basic, simplistic animation for this entire series. If you are interested in rigging, I do have a rigging series on this channel. You can make as complicated animation as you desire. But in this case, I'm going super simple. I've aligned everything here, and it's going to come into Unity that way as well. But there's a couple things that are really important. First of all, I've saved this as a PSB file. The PSB files are what Unity works with. It'll break everything up really nicely if you're utilizing a PSB file. It's a plugin that's automatically available whenever you're working with in 2D. If we take a look at my layers here in Photoshop, I have a bunch of layers, and each of these individual layers has one thing on it or something that I want to be separate from the other objects. And that way I can use these layers to animate them, turn them on and off, etc. When I bring this PSB file into Unity, Unity will examine the layers. It will break up the object that I bring in into these individual layers. So it'll go through and it'll slice them up so that I've got everything nice and sliced and I can see every individual piece. And it will assign each of these layers, starting from the bottom down here. This is my lowest layer. My lowest layer will receive an order and layer value. That's the lowest. And then it'll add one for each of these layers in Unity to the order and layer. So each of these things will be rendered on top of each other in the precise order that you have them right here in your layers in Photoshop. Okay, so let's drag this out of the way and take a look at it in Unity. So here in Unity, here's that character. I have dragged that character in. Let me just go to my sprites here, to my character sprites. This is what it's going to look like when you drag it in. If I click on this little arrow, I can see that Unity has broken up all those individual layers into proper sliced out layers within Unity as well. If I click on this character, so let's go to here to our character and let's open it up in the sprite editor. In the sprite editor, I can actually see the same thing. So here it is already all sliced up. I can see each of those individual layers that were in Photoshop broken up into individual parts here in Unity. So that's great. I now have access to each of these parts. You'll notice that some of them are white. So I've got some things that are white here. And what I'm going to do with this character, I've decided to make this into a randomized character. It's going to be randomized into a particular like fantasy type or fantasy class. If you play Dungeons and Dragons, a fantasy class. I've got wizards and I've got barbarians and fighters, etc. And it's going to create a character from the parts that I have here. Now, specific parts go with specific characters, but I do want to randomize some of it. The parts that are white, so the beard, the different, all the things here that are white, I will later on tint, and that will allow those things to change their outfit colors as well. Okay, so this is how it's been broken up. Let me drag our sprite editor out of the way. Great. And here it is inside of Unity. Now, inside of Unity, nothing has really changed from when we built the asset originally. Right here, we've got ourselves our player base like we had before, our player art like we had before. Here's our aim base and our aim art. So all this is identical. It'll still work exactly the same way. What I have done is I've taken this file that I brought in and I've dragged it into my player art. So now I've gotten rid of the circle that we were using before as the body of this character, and I've replaced it with the art that I've created. Okay, great. Inside of the art, here are all my bits and pieces. They are all aligned the same way they were in Photoshop. They're all going to render properly. Now, they're not all being rendered here. And you might be looking at it saying, why? And I've turned some of them off, yes. But some of them are not here. I only have one face, so this is my wizard face. I only have one weapon. This is my weapon, and some of the other things are turned on and off. Okay, so what is this going to allow me to do? I am going to replace this image, the face, and the weapon whenever I change out this character. And then I'm going to turn on and off the things that I want this character to have. That's how I'm going to randomize this particular character. And we're going to do this with something called scriptable objects. Scriptable objects are basically data containers that are going to allow us to separate from, so we keep our data separate from anything that's located within the scene. So if you wanted to build 10 different characters, if I wanted to build a gnome and I wanted to build a fighter and a barbarian and a wizard, etc., I could go through and I could build each one and then I could save it as a prefab and I could add in all of their individual abilities and their weapons, etc. I could do that as prefabs, and that's a valid way of doing it. You can absolutely do it that way if you wish. What I've decided to do instead is take out all of the common elements and save something called a scriptable object. And we'll take a look at those in just one second. The scriptable object is basically data that I will then apply to this particular character. If I'm creating a barbarian character, it's going to replace the face with a barbarian and the weapon with a barbarian's weapon. If it's a wizard, it'll be a wizard's face and a wizard's weapon, etc. Okay, so that's how a scriptable objects work, or how we're going to be using them. Let's take a look at exactly what I've done here, just so you can see where we are right now. I haven't changed anything. I'm going to close this up. I'm going to hit play right now. And here we go. We've generated one of the characters. You can see that it's a different head. It's a different weapon. It's got a shield. The parts that down here that were white previously are now purple. So I've randomized this character, and that's what I want to do. I want to randomize this character based on, some values that I've given it. Okay, let's take a look at the animation while we're here as well. I've added some animation, super, super simple walking animation. This is it. This is all the animation I currently have. I'll show you how I've done that, but everything else still works exactly the same way. I can still aim in the same way I did previously. I can move around. I can aim separately, so we can still move around and fight. This is how I'm going to do this. I'm not going to go anything fancy. You guys are more than welcome to do fancy stuff for your own game. But in this time, it's kind of actually a relief not to have to do all of that animation. So this episode is not actually about animation, but let me just really quickly show you how I did it. If I click on my player art, so where I think I did it, in my animation, yes, right here, all I've added in is a player run. Here, if we go to our animator, I've added in a player idle, which is literally just the character keyed as you've seen it, so it goes back to that position. I've got a player run, which is just the character kind of dodging back and forth, bouncing back and forth. That's what the player run is. You saw the player run. If I take a look at the transitions themselves, I've got a quick transition from the idle to the run. Whenever is moving, the parameter is moving is set to true. I will move to the run. Whenever is moving is set to false. I will leave the run and move back to idle. I've got a longer transition here to allow for a softer settle. If I've got a tight transition by scrunching this thing down, I'll snap back into position. If I extend this transition so it's the longer length of the idle, then it will smooth in. It might even have some back and forth before it actually settles. So I've just kind of picked a random value for now. It felt good. I left it. Let's take a look at the code really quickly. So the code that I've had to add, I added in a reference to my animator. That's all I've added in, my reference to my animator here. I find my animator, get component in my start. Afterwards, on my on move, I simply set the is moving parameter that you saw in my animator to the moving value that we set up before. So if it's moving, it's true. If it's not moving, it's false. It'll switch it back and forth. And that's it. That's all I've had to add in order to get this thing animated. There's nothing else that's been added here. Okay, great. Let's get this out of the way. What I really want to talk about in this episode is the randomization of that character and the idea of scriptable objects. Okay, so let's go back to our scene. We already saw the character, my simple fantasy character. I've got the shadow pulled out of what originally came in so I can animate it separately. I've removed some of the stuff, as I've already said. I've only got one weapon, one face. Other things are turned off. Let's take a look at what a scriptable object is. Actually, let me bring my code back here for a second and take a look at what a scriptable object is. As I've already mentioned, it is simply a data container. That's it. It's a data container, and it allows us to keep our data separate from an object located within the hierarchy of our game. So it's not actually within the hierarchy. It's not actually in the scene. It is stored outside of the scene, and I can access these files through various methods. When you create yourself a scriptable object, you can then make copies of that object that contains specific data that you can use. So let's take a look at how we set up a scriptable object. All of your scriptable objects will take this form: public, class, and the name of the scriptable object, and it inherits from scriptable object. Afterwards, you can go through and you can add any data that you want to your scriptable object. In this case, I've given it a class name, so I'm going to call it barbarian or wizard, etc. I've given it a sprite for the head, so as I change out the head, a sprite for the weapon, change it to weapons. I have a whether or not it has hair or doesn't have hair, whether or not it has a shield. So some characters 100% have a shield, some characters don't have a shield. So in each case, it's going to have an option of whether or not it can have a shield. If it does, which shield can it have? Which belt can it have? What kind of beard can it have? And if it has any additional clothing. So some of my characters have additional clothing, like the barbarian who has no clothes on has to have a loincloth, so it has additional clothing. So let me drag this out of the way. Oh, one last thing. Right here, create asset menu, file name equals player, new player class, player class. This is going to make your scriptable object available in your create menu. Okay, well, let's take a look at that right now. So I'm going to drag this out of the way. Okay, so if we go into our project tab right here, we can see the scriptable object that I've saved. If I click on it, this is the scriptable object that we saved just a moment ago. It's now located here, same stuff. And you can see that I've created a number of different assets that are based on that scriptable object. I've got a barbarian, a cleric, a druid, a fighter, a gnome, a ranger, and a wizard. If I click on any one of these, let's say the barbarian, you can see that I've given it a name, I filled in all the data, and now that data will become available to me in code later on by referencing this particular scriptable object. If I want to create a new one, I can go to the plus sign. I can come up here to player class because we added that line of code in our script and click on player class. It'll automatically create for me a brand new one. Let's make a Casanis class. All right, there we go. Casanis, I can give it a name. Casanis, blah, blah, blah. Here we go. A head. If I want to add in a head, let me just lock this. Let's go down to our sprites, our character sprites. Let's add in a head. Let's add in a weapon. There we go. So I can add all the stuff in, and as soon as I do so, it'll automatically become available to me inside of this scriptable object. So if I come back here, my Casanis, if I click off onto something else, so it's locked right now. If I click off onto something else, fighter, and I click back on a Casanis, you can see that data is automatically saved. So I've got this information stored right here as a scriptable object, and then it's going to be available to me in the scene. Let's dump this. I don't need it. Delete. Yes, I'm sure I want to delete that. So now rather than going through and creating a number of different prefabs, I can make reference to my scriptable objects and change my class based on that. So I've done that in randomizing this character. Let me let me show you on here first. So if we go here to our player base, I've created myself this initialized character script. This script is not going to be the same for you, so there's no real need for you to actually like go through and see what I've done here, but I'm going to drag it over and show you just so you kind of know what you might want to do in the future. So here is my initialization, my initialized character script, and I've got a number of different options as far as public references to objects within the scene. I've got a reference to the sprite renderer for the head, for the weapon, the different shields. It's an array, so I have a number of different shields, a number of different belts, etc. And all I'm going to do in the initialization is I'm going to come in and I'm going to examine. So up here where I have the scriptable object, I've declared my player character scriptable object, and I made an array of available PCs. So these are, the different classes that I've created. I go in and I choose a class. So I randomly choose one of the classes. And then once I do, I create the character and the character's look based on the information I pull out of the scriptable object. There looks like a lot of code here, and I'm just going through each of the parts of the scriptable object and saying, okay, well, this is the image for the face then. This is the image for the weapon, and so on. I have some code in here that determines whether or not the character has a beard, whether or not the character has long hair, whether I've got different code in here that determines that, but all that comes from the available PC, from the actual scriptable object I created. That's it. So based on your scriptable object, you will create this initialization. I have gone through and I've randomized the color as well, and that's going to give me a little bit of extra in there. So a little bit of difference in the different characters. So even if I generate two clerics, the two clerics won't be the same. One might have a purple outfit, one might have long hair, and the hair could be green, and etc., etc. So I've added some additional randomization in there. There's not a lot of code. And not a lot I have to show you here. It's going to be dependent on what you've created. So me showing you precisely what I've done here is not really going to help you. Just understand the logic of what I've done. I've gone through and done a really kind of basic job here, all based on randomization, whether or not I want something turned on or off. That's it. And all of it is based on that scriptable object. That's how they work. So every time I click this button, I get a different reference to a different class. There's my druid. Let's see. There's my wizard, and so on. So you guys can see how quickly scriptable objects can be used, how you can avoid things like creating a whole bunch of different prefabs, one for each character class, by making these simple scriptable objects for this randomization. I've saved myself a lot of time. And we're going to use scriptable objects throughout this series. That was a really quick look at scriptable objects. We did not go into detail. They are extremely useful. We're going to be using them throughout this series, so that's why I'm mentioning them now. If you guys want to create randomized characters, try this as an exercise on your own. Create yourself a really simple scriptable object, swap out some images, swap out some colors. That's it. Keep it really simple just to test it for now. Later on, we're going to use it for things like enemies, for a ton of different things. All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, let me know down below with a thumbs up. And if you didn't, a thumbs down is perfectly fine. I haven't done this in a really long time. I'm probably a little bit rusty. I accept that. These videos are for my students. They are going through and building a 2D top-down shooter right now, and I want them to have as much information as I can. So they have access to me in class. They have classes, like I said, with me and their other faculty, but I want them to have these videos as well. So if you are watching this and you're not in my class, I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope you're getting something out of this as well. All right, guys? Thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.